from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
One of the topics that we deal with on this program from time to time deals with what I would put in the category of a human interest story. And I don't know when we've had a program in which this category is more fitting. I'm very pleased to announce to you, our viewers, that today and again next week in part 1 and 2, we'll be interviewing a most interesting guest by the name of Paul Mahar. Many of you are very familiar that recently NBC and Mr. Brokaw did a fascinating story on our guest and also People magazine. I welcome Mr. Mahar to talk about an experience he had years ago that affected his life both then and from now on. You've probably read about the information that Mr. Mahar decided to help his friend who had been drafted and had gone through basic training and was assigned to go to Vietnam. And Paul Mahar decided to take his friend's place and went to Vietnam under the name of another individual. It is a fascinating story, and it is my belief that it will take 2 weeks to unfold and tell this very, very interesting story. Paul, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you here, and you've been most generous with your time as we prepared for this 2-week series, and we know that our viewers are going to be inspired by the story, and we're also impressed with your candidness and your sincerity. Again, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have regular panelist Steve Shank, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and we shall ask Steve to commence the series of questions.
Thank you, Tony. Paul, I was sitting here thinking as Tony did his introduction that we have a tendency maybe to trivialize the concept of friendship. Anybody who, if we know their first and last name, have some idea what they do and where they live, we refer to them as a friend. But certainly there are meanings, degrees of meanings of that term. And what you did goes beyond what most of us would consider an act of friendship. And I thought maybe we ought to spend some time and lay a foundation for understanding the relationship you had with the friend whose place you took in Vietnam. Would you take us back to the beginning, how you two met and became friends?
At the end of the 7th grade, my family rented a house in North Arlington, New Jersey. And the house was, we rented it, and the house was sold, so we had to move. And we had to move within a month, and my parents found another house on Peck Avenue in Newark, and it was where my father worked. And there was a bunch of kids playing on the street, so my parents decided that there was another house to rent, and we did that. And that's where I met Frank, and there was a whole bunch of kids on the street that were my age, and I have a younger brother who was his age, and we got together and we played and we became friends. This would have been in the summer before the 8th grade. We went to different schools in the same neighborhood. I went to a parochial school, and he went to the public school.
And this would have been in what year?
1960, I believe. Right. And it was only 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks after I moved there that we wrestled, like 13-year-old boys. Push came to shove, and temper started to flare. And he was a little shorter than I was and a little heavier, and he fell on top of me, and I hit the cement, and my arm was underneath, and it broke. And my arm came here and kind of bent down because both bones were broken. And I put my hand here, walked home. Parents took me to the hospital, and because I was such a skinny kid, they set the arm twice, and it wouldn't stay set. Third time they put pins and plates in it, and that's what makes me 4F. Years later, it showed I couldn't get drafted. I lived in Newark for just the year of the 8th grade. Family moved to Summit. I think a year later, Frank moved to southern New Jersey, Lakewood, or a little town outside of Lakewood. And we got together in the summertime and sometime in the weekends. And we were kind of troublemakers in the city, and that was one of the reasons our parents moved. But it just seemed like every time we got together, something disastrous happened, or whether the arm or some other things. And yeah, we maintained a friendship. He met the woman he married, eventually married in Newark, and she moved down south. Her family moved down south with him. And I think after I when I was 18 or 19, I moved down there and got a job in a plastics factory. And he got married in September of '65. Got drafted in January of '66, or got his first letter, and went to basic training in March.
The story about the broken arm, of course, we're going to talk about in more detail because it's real key to what happened for you and for your friend. But I want to go back to that friendship relationship just a little bit. What you described doesn't sound like a best buddy, my best friend in the world kind of a relationship. Is that accurate? Or is this fellow your best friend? Was he then?
Yeah, I guess there were three of us that were real good friends, Frank and Drew and I, and we became good friends, and then Frank and I became like partners. You know, we just were hanging out a whole lot together and double dated and played football and stuff. And so there was a friendship there, but I think that he was kind of leader of the street, of the kids on the street, and I was new to the neighborhood, so that's where the attachment happened, and the pecking order was established as to the way it is, like with lion cubs and 13-year-old boys. And I'm not sure what the attraction to each other was. It seemed like when we got together, we got in trouble. You know, maybe that was part of it. And there was a lot of probably competitive to us. And I'm not sure. Maybe if you ask me in 5 more years why the friendship existed, but I was the one that had the ability to do crazy things. That was my little niche. I was the one who had a little firecracker in my hand, let it go off for 50 cents one time. And I could do, I was the one to climb the street lights and stuff like that. So that was me. I had that was my little niche. And Frank was, he wasn't that way. He just, everything had to be right and followed a rule. And so we were just kind of Jack Sprat, could eat no fat kind of deal. Mm-hmm. And that's where the friendship existed.
Do you stay in touch?
No, and I'm not sure where you want to get into the story about that. But when I came back from Vietnam, I stayed at his house. I've said before it was a week, could have even been a month, I'm not sure. And the words that I used then, I use now, is we had created a situation that neither one of us was old enough or mature enough to cope with. And I've used those words more than twice. Friendship had to die. And I haven't seen him since January of 1968, although we've talked a few times.
I want to continue on that because I know our viewing audience, even though some have read about this story, would be very, very interested in the details, and that's why we want to take 2 weeks. Steve has done such a good job moving us into what the friendship was, and I think it'd be good for our viewers to know too that Frank's last name was Klauss. Is that correct?
Uh-huh.
Frank Klauss. As you were talking, I was almost hearing opposites attract in friendship as well. Maybe it's in marriage, that even though you both were maybe daring and within relation to the street activity, that he probably was fascinated with you, that you were more challenging than he in those kind of physical endeavors. And I guess what is brought to my mind as we move later into both of you being young adult men, and he was drafted and you were not. We'll move into that in a moment. But what comes to mind is that I heard you say that he followed the rules and he sounds like more cautious. As we move toward that story, do you suppose that kind of difference in personality may have led to this agreement that you made after he had gone through the draft and he had also gone through basic training? In all this that I have read and studied, you have triggered a different kind of thinking for me in relation to the personalities involved.
Yeah, he had to be safe, and so I was the natural friend. I give you an example of something that maybe, he was married in '65. He had a year engagement. He was engaged he got engaged or married September '65. I believe he was engaged in September '64. He waited a whole year to have the perfect engagement.
Uh-huh.
All right?
Uh-huh.
If he hadn't waited a year, I think that's when they changed the deferments. He would not have been draftable because they weren't drafting married men. So his sense of protocol was there. I remember being kids, there wasn't a hair out of his place. I mean, he spent an hour combing his hair, where my hair has always been like this kind of, even as a 13-year-old, it went whatever way it went. So everything, even from the way he dressed, everything just had to be so.
So that really is a setting there that that since you were daring and he played it safe, that's why he would view the possibility of going to Vietnam in a very different light than you would. Although I know you're going to tell the story where you didn't think you were going to go to Vietnam either, but I just think we've hit something here that is just it set the stage for this agreement that you two came to. I think we've reached the point where maybe our viewers are so curious that we need to get right into that. You've known one another these years, and you've done the kind of things that you said. He was the leader that played it safe, but had others that were doing daring things like you. And you get through high school, and he gets drafted, and he goes through basic training. You're not drafted, again, because of the physical condition which he'd helped create. Start at that point and tell our viewers about what happened to him in basic training and how he came home and the conversation and the major decision that you and he made at that point.
He went to basic in Fort Dix for 9 weeks in March of '66. He gets off for 2 weeks, then he has to go to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for what they call advanced infantry training. After that was over, I took his wife, and we drove down there to pick him up, just on a whim.
And he'd gone through basic training, plus he'd gone through this special training.
Right, it was normal. That's what everybody did. And
can I interrupt again to say the special training was preparation for what might happen in Vietnam?
Right, he got.
This has a significance to you later.
Right, I mean, he got. He was trained as a mortarman in AIT in Louisiana, and when he left Louisiana, he had orders for Vietnam. He had a 28-day leave and then orders to report to Fort Dix. And so we drove back, fell asleep on the wheel in Virginia, ran the car off the road. He and Margie, his wife, took the bus back, and they sent me $100 to get out of jail, and then I hitchhiked back home, which is just another one of the things that happen in life, And,
but again, here you are in the role of the daring, and he's
right.
more safe.
And so I went back and went back to my job in the plastics factory, and I had a pretty good job, or was getting better, and I was working from 8 to 5 or something like that, and lived in a rooming house where you got a room and kitchen privileges, and sometime after his 28-day leave, he came to my rooming house, told me he was AWOL, and asked me to hide him. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I kept him there, and then what I did is I gave notice where I lived and found another rooming house so that if anybody was looking for him, they would know where I was living. They would, maybe look at the other house. And so I got us 2 adjacent rooms, and we stayed in those 2 rooms, I don't know, 4 or 6 weeks, and I would go to work every day, and then through there the plot got concocted, and it was never for me to go to Vietnam.
Can I ask that during that crucial time that he was really hiding out there, I would suppose that he didn't go out, he stayed in all that time, or would he get out?
I would assume that he stayed in. That's what my memory tells me, although I don't have a whole bunch of picture memories, but he would have hidden from people he knew.
And was his wife with him at that point?
His wife would have been in her own apartment, and he would have, gone to see her when nobody else was around, because there was a lot of, his family and her family, all lived in the same town. The plan was for me to go to Fort Dix as him, and we changed the 201 file, height and weight, ripped up the ID card with his picture, and I would tell him.
Can I back up just for a moment, because again, my
Sure.
viewers, this is such a real crucial point. When you started to do this, did you at some point, how did this come about in discussion? Did he sit down and say that he just couldn't do this, or was there a particular evening or time when you made the crucial decision?
I don't think there was a particular moment. He would have talked about not wanting to be a soldier. When he was in AIT, somebody had gotten killed, or not killed, but hurt by accident in the training, and he remembered he was sick of it. I'll tell you the same words that I told Tom Brokaw. He wanted to be with his wife. That was his lines. He needed to be with her. He was responsible for her, and that's what he wanted to do. And the draft, like it was for most people, was an interference in your life. Mm-hmm. And I don't know because this is 1966, there was little anti-war demonstrations, or those feelings were only beginning to rumble. So it was an interference with his life, and why is the Army drafting me, and why do I have to go, and I can't be away for so long? And so these were the words that I heard from him.
Did you initiate the idea? Well, I can.
Don't really remember who initiated it. It would have probably been him, just from the history of our relationship. It's like, we can do this or something, that kind of thing, that we can work this out. And I said, what are you talking about? And that kind of thing. And the idea was for me to go and say I was him. And that right here was a reason that the Army should let me go as he. And that's what I tried to do. And we had probably thought about it for more than a month, because I remember I got my hair cut twice, to keep it real short. And then telling them that I'd lost my ID card, so when a picture was taken, it would have his name and my picture on it. So there'd be no question there. And the information he had given me would have been things like, general is more important than a colonel, that basic Army military stuff, so that I wouldn't feel entirely stupid, and just to go in there and tell them this would work.
And so you had really prepared this plan with some documentation so that you could pass for him.
Oh yeah, yeah. The idea was to tell the Army that I was Frank, I was AWOL because he was. And there was the pin. You've made a mistake, and let me go. What have we done here? Oh, glasses. And
at this point, I'll let Steve pick up the program and what happened.
The whole thing is fascinating, and I keep trying to imagine it in my mind. Did you discuss at all as you put this plan together the possible ramifications for both of you? Is that something you talked about? I'm assuming there were two illegal acts involved.
There are, because there are two illegal acts. His of being AWOL, mine of fraud.
Mm-hmm. Because you said it wasn't anti-war sentiment, really.
No, it was the rules were rules of friendship.
Mm-hmm.
They existed between he and I, and this was the rules of one friend helping another. And I'm not sure how well you remember being 19, but
it's not been that long ago for me.
Okay, not me either, right? But 19, everything was possible.
Yeah.
You could do anything, or you had to try anything, because this is you're marking yourself for your transition into adulthood, and to turn your back on things was not acceptable in a lot of ways.
So the thought of that risk, legal risk, it wasn't a factor for you.
It wasn't. I don't know if it was a factor for him. I think maybe after it was over it was, but at that point it wasn't for me. I really can't answer for him.
I've got to cut to the chase a little bit. What went wrong? I mean, why when you were able to stick that arm out, show him the scar, and say you've made a mistake, I've got this badly broken arm, what?
You work in a bureaucracy because you teach here in school. Once the bureaucracy starts to roll or things happen, people don't turn it around.
The orders were cut. You were headed for Vietnam.
If I had gotten that far, why would somebody turn it around? All of a sudden, this is an exception to the rule. Think of all the students in your classes. If one person says, well, no, follow the crowd and do it. That's human nature, the way it does. Nobody in the Army would have assumed that I wasn't him. That's not even a question that would have popped in anybody's mind. If you had made it this far, you need to go, and let's get him on that plane, because that's the least trouble for everybody.
What kind of a reception did you get when you showed up? At this point, what would it have been, 6, 8, 10 weeks AWOL?
Something like that. They put me in barracks number 8, which was the barracks for people in transition, people that were AWOL, people that the Army had discipline problems with. And I stayed there for 5 days, and I only know that from the Army records, how long I was there. And I kept saying I'm not going. They kept saying you're going, just forget this.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have to remember that I'm 19, dealing with people that are 22, 25, 35, and older, and they're just, they're smarter than I am, they're older than I am, and they know all the tricks, and they have the support system behind them. And what eventually happened, and the way this is the one visual image that I remember, is I'm standing with an older sergeant, and I'm going to call him older. He must have been 30 or 40, you know. And he gave me a pack and a half of Pall Mall and the name of somebody in Saigon who could help me because he was passing me down to somebody else. And he told me that I needed to go. He told me that I had to do this. It was part of growing up, and that I didn't want to think of myself as not doing it.
So they just naturally assumed, and I guess it would be a natural assumption. Here's a kid who comes in after being AWOL.
Says he doesn't
tried
want
to
to
run
go.
out of his obligation once.
Right.
This is just another story he's concocted. Yeah, right. You broke your arm.
Right.
Get on the truck, and we're gonna and then
Right,
get on the
right.
plane. We're gonna fly you to Vietnam.
Uh-huh.
So that part they didn't treat that seriously. There was no serious punishment involved for the AWOL.
No, because I got on the plane.
Now I've got to ask this question: at that point, did it go through your mind at all to say, well, tough luck, Frank. I mean, I'm taking this only so far, and that far, and Vietnam is too far. Did you think about backing out on your agreement and saying, my job was to get us both out, and I can't, so Frank's back in?
No, I did what most people did, is I procrastinated. Because, you know, it's like, okay, I'm getting on the plane. All right, I have, you know, as many hours it takes to get to Vietnam to change my mind. All right, maybe I can still do this while I'm there. And so I procrastinated my day of just looking at everybody and saying, hi, you know, I'm not really who you think I am. And to see whether I could still make it work in Saigon. And yeah, I mean, procrastination is something so you don't have to face the reality. And that was probably my mindset, that I could still do this.
In the back of your mind, that was always your
I could always,
tomorrow I
could always, yeah, tomorrow I
say,
could
hey,
always
I'm not
stop.
Frank.
I could always say tomorrow, and it's like, oh, anything else? If you give up smoking or something like that, well, I can always do it tomorrow. I got one more day to get my act together, or so you procrastinate the day of delivery in a sense.
Or they might change their mind by tomorrow and
Right.
and take the story.
Yeah.
Before the program ends, and it's just been moving so rapidly, and you are really being so informative with this story. We have some photographs that you brought, and we appreciate that. And on our program next week, we're going to go into the story, what happened in Vietnam and when you came home, and how this process with the Army went through to regain your identity. But I'm going to ask them, and they're putting on the screen now. Here's one of the pictures from where I'm sitting. You're on the far left. Is that not right, Paul?
Uh-huh.
Would you tell us a little something about this? Again, that youthfulness is there, and as you talked about other people being older than you when they were making that decision. Is this over in Vietnam, is it?
Yeah, this is in Vietnam. It looks like one of the times that we came back from the field, drinking beer, like all soldiers do. That's Al Cerna. His nickname was Luke, and I just talked to him on the phone about a week ago.
Is that the one in the center?
In the center. I'm not sure who that is on the right, but this would have been one of those nights where, came back from the field, and everybody would have bought a case of beer, and we sat down and just ate and drank until we fell asleep, for lack of a better word.
Yes. And so you're in Vietnam and you're in action. We're not going to get into the details of that on this particular program, but they're going to bring up on the screen again another photograph. I want to take us, if we can, through about 4 photographs. And here you are again in Vietnam.
Yeah, now all the pictures that you're showing were probably all taken, you know, the same night. That seems obvious from the people around. Mm-hmm. But it was just a bunch of guys with a bunch of beer and a moment to relax, or a night to relax. And when I look at those pictures, it's hard to think that was me. I mean, it's so many years, and I look so young, and I don't even look 19. You know, it's closer to 14 or 15.
Yeah, you look like 14.
14 or 15,
When
so
we
I have to assume that that's kind of true.
And here's another photograph.
Mm-hmm. And I would have been there, I'm going to say at least 4 to 6 months, because of the length of my hair. Mm-hmm. You know, and because when I went over there, I was bald, you know, Army bald.
And of course, when you're in that kind of action, you don't get the same kind of treatment that you do here or in basic training. I know before the program, you and I were looking at those photographs, and I really heard what you said. You looked at me and said, I'm not sure I know who that is.
Right.
Because there's really a lot of difference in time, what people do and how they make decisions.
Yeah, and from the other soldiers I talked to and stuff, it's incredible. You know, I did that. You know, I mean, if I didn't know that I had done it, you know, it would seem like a different person. Mm-hmm. You know, like grade school or in some of the things I did in my 20s.
Now
as well.
here is a picture, a photograph of a different place. You're out in the field.
Yeah, and Gary Pierce would have taken that picture. I mean, these are the pictures that he took and sent me copies. And
I wanted to pursue along that line with where we're at now in a chronological order. You got on the plane and you went to Vietnam, as you said from these photographs. You were out in the field and you were back in at the camp. When you first arrived in Vietnam, you are in a remarkable situation. You've had no basic training, you've had no special schooling, and of course your supervisors do not know this, and here you are just like off of the streets and put in this incredible situation. Was there any period of time between your arrival in Vietnam and your going out into combat and action, or was it almost immediately?
Probably 2 weeks. Everybody went to what was the 90th Replacement Battalion, Long Binh, and they were assigned to their duty stations or wherever they went from there. And so I was in Long Binh for, I'm going to say, a week or more. There was a 5-day orientation that everybody had to go through, so everybody else is going, oh, I've heard all that before, you know, and I'm listening and I'm paying attention.
A crash course.
A crash course. And there was a practice ambush patrol that we did, you know, the night that they kind of set it up just outside the perimeter. And then I was convoyed 20 miles north to Cu Chi, to the unit I was in, and then I was probably there 3 or 4 days, and then flown up to Tay Ninh, which is the Black Virgin Mountain, another 20 miles north. And that's where I spent my first night out in the field, and that's a visual image I have.
It's amazing how I'm sure that military people assume that no one would take someone else's identity and go to war or go into action like this. But you told stories about even the polishing the boots and so forth, that nowhere along the way there was any suspicion that you had not been trained?
Well, you know, I don't think so. I would have been, you know, there would have been, say, 10 replacements, you know, into the company that I went into, or maybe more. In those 10 or 15 people, everybody's treated as a new guy. Forget everything you learned and do it my way, because that's the way it needed to be. And so you would have had a level, this guy is the best of the 10 and this guy is the worst of the 10. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it would have, somebody had to be the worst. And so for the first month or two, I would have been the worst of the 10.
And you were there and actions taking place. They don't have so much time to worry about such things. I've got the note that we're out of time.
Okay.
But Paul, I want to say to our viewers that the very good news is that we'll have you back next week, and we'll finish this story about what went on in Vietnam, and when you came back home, then regaining your identity. On behalf of Steve and our panel, we thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to being with you again next week.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do invite you to be with us when we do part 2 of this remarkable story of how one man took the identity of another man and went and fought in Vietnam. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Welcome to part 2 of our 2-week series with our guest, Paul Mahar. For those viewers that were not with us last week, we got part of the way through this really fascinating story. We put this under the category of our programs of a human interest story. And for you who have not heard about this intriguing story, Paul Mahar took the place of his friend, Frank Klauss, and went to Vietnam under his name during the Vietnam conflict. It's received lots of publicity on such programs as NBC with Brokaw and also People magazine. Last week when our guest was here, we talked about their childhood together, Paul Mahar and Frank Klauss, and and how this evolved into a point that after basic training, in which Frank Klauss had been drafted and Paul Mahar had not been because of an injury to Paul's arm that had been brought about in the wrestling match with his friend, and after basic training, Frank Klauss, who was married, decided he just would not go to Vietnam, and Paul took his place. We're picking up this story in Vietnam where Paul was, and we're very happy to have you with us again, Paul.
Thank you.
And we're very pleased to have our regular panelist, Steve Shank, the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Dakota College, and Steve will pick up the story at this time.
Paul, last week we talked a little bit, and just to summarize that, you took your friend's place, hoping to show them a badly broken arm with the plates and screws in it, and be discharged. That didn't work. They didn't buy that story. They sent you to Vietnam. If there had been a moment of panic when they said, "Sure, yeah, get on the plane," that must have even been heightened when you actually got to Vietnam. You haven't had any training. You're in a totally foreign country and about to go into combat. Tell us a little bit about what that must have been like for you. How difficult was it?
I was scared. Yes, I remember that, and just like, well, how did I get in this situation? I mean, all of a sudden, 2 weeks ago I was working in a plastics factory. Now I'm here. I had the ability to procrastinate. I knew that always tomorrow I could say, "Stop. I needed to. That I've gone too far. Shouldn't push this any further." And so that was a kind of a savior. And a savior to me, because I always knew that I could leave at any time. For the first, I'm going to say 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a little longer, I tried to get out because of the arm. I think it's probably going to come up in the records that I, went to my captain or something and said, "You need to let me go," and proceeded with that. And I would have probably told Frank that I'm still trying to do this, and he would have been back in New Jersey, waiting or afraid, or don't want to put words in his mouth. Sometime in January, and I got there in November, in January I felt comfortable with what I was doing. I felt adequate. And if we talk about roles that friends have, I couldn't leave the people I was with. Fred was my friend. Richard and Rondi and John Hanner have been killed. I belong there. And there's a part of me has the heart of a soldier. I thought that I could help those people. They belonged to me. I think that I had already proved myself to them, that I was their equal, and that was important to me. I couldn't walk away from it. I couldn't walk away. Vietnam, beyond the moral issues of the war, it demands that you take a stand somewhere individually as one person, and couldn't walk away from the people I was with, and so I stayed.
Is there a part of that experience for you that aside from the fear and aside from the difficult conditions, the heat and the mud, and all the other things that you had to go through, the seeing friends killed in combat, is there part of it that was exciting, that you enjoyed at all?
The old line about Vietnam is it's a $1 million experience and nobody repeats for a nickel. Exciting is not the word, but in soldiers' words, there's camaraderie, there's a bonding between other people. There's that you're doing something important, and it's not winning a war. It's a human connection to somebody else. It's the best part of human nature, or it's the best part of human nature that comes out when you're with these other people. And that's what keeps you there. You can't walk away from that, or I couldn't.
One thing you got a lot of publicity about during your stay in Vietnam, and I think you're so honest, and I really appreciate that. It really draws the attention of American people when you say that you were one of the tunnel rats, or you went into the tunnels, but that sounds like it was a special unit and only a few did that. Would you explain what you did and how you perceive that differently?
Well, there were the 65th engineers that were a special unit. They went in them, but we also, as I was a Wolfhound, we went in them individually. And,
in addition to that special unit?
Yeah, in addition to that special unit, because they would have had to been called in. And we all took our turns doing that. you can't look. I mean, if you got a whole bunch of people that says the lieutenant needs somebody to go down this tunnel, you look, and you and I are both small, and we know that we're prime targets for stuff like this. Do I look and I go hide behind a tree and say, so you do it or you do the same? You can't do that. You can't do that. And so we went in by ourselves, and we went in together, and yeah, and it was time to do it. You know, it's, could you have walked and hid behind a tree, so I had to go in?
I guess you never know until you're in that situation.
Yeah, okay, but yeah, so you do that, and you go in there with your friends, and you say, well, I'll go first this time, or you go first another time. And I can tell you that one of the times I did go in, you know, is my funny story, and I went around a corner, and I came face to face with a chicken. You know, the chicken went buck, 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 you know, just like that. And I didn't fire the pistol, because if you fire the pistol, it probably broke your eardrums. And if Charlie had sent the chicken in the tunnel to slow me down, you can trust that, number one, it worked. Because I think I came back out and took a break or something. But it was 20 years later that I thought, and I laughed, with two chickens in the hole, me and the other one. But yeah, we did that. And we crawled on our hands and knees, and there were booby traps in there. And it was awful, and it was scary. But you did that.
Yes. Paul, when your time was up, I'm moving rather rapidly because we have a lot to tell about when you come back to the United States. You extended your stay, even though you could have come home. Would you briefly tell us why you did that?
Well, somebody had to go in the service afterwards, you know, and Frank had written me a letter and said, you know, you could do this better than I, or something like that. And at that point, when I wrote it in the book, I entered the twilight zone. I had just done so much, and then I said, okay, what do I do? I knew that if you had less than 90 days in Vietnam, you were discharged. So I extended 45 days, signed the papers, and said, okay, so that way when it's over, nobody has to go, and then it's ended. Because, you know, in one sense, I needed it for me, too.
Yeah. So that happened, you return home. Now, after you get back to the United States, and here you are saying from the military records that you're Frank Klauss, but you're going to have to come back to be Paul Mahar, and you've got to meet your family. And I guess one thing we better tell about this whole story is, you know, our viewers will be wondering, well, how did the family deal with your being gone? You had covered your tracks well there, hadn't you?
Oh, I had covered my tracks well there. When I went to my parents' house, because I stayed at Frank's house a couple weeks before we decided that we didn't need to be around each other. And I went home and I told my mom what had happened. And you always break things to your mom before you tell your dad, you know. Told my mom what had happened, and then I told my dad what had happened. But my mother called my sister to come take a look at my feet, because my feet were rotten. We all came home with, and they were rotten for a long time. My sister was a nurse, so I said, what do we need to do for Paul's feet, ...
But your family didn't know you were in Vietnam, because you had sent letters, had you not, to make them think that you were living somewhere else in New Jersey.
Yeah, so I mean, when I told them the truth, you know, my mother said, I knew by the look on your face that you weren't in New Jersey, that life was different. My sister said the same thing. And I can remember talking to my dad, and the family that I came from was, okay, you did this? Yeah, that sounds like something you do, Paul. And then it's over, and where do we go from here? So it was just an event that just, my father said he was really proud of me, and he probably gave me one of those looks like, yeah, where did you come from, or something, you know.
After this story to your family, how long was it before you went public or contacted the military, or told Frank that you wanted to reveal what had really happened?
This is 1984. Was I called Frank on the telephone. I was living in Idaho at the time, and about that time there was all the news about Agent Orange and stuff like that, and Vietnam was becoming popular again, and I just started thinking about it. And I called him on the phone, and we talked, and I just, I was going to find a way to look for friends and maintain the secret and stuff like that. And I would try little things, put an ad in USA Today or little newspaper articles over the years. And I got no luck. And then about, I guess 3 or 4 years, and I just did that on and off. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a letter to People magazine. I forget People, I wrote a letter to different magazines, got a response back from People, from a senior editor, and he said, if you can get the Army to say it happened, then I'll print it, okay, because they have to cover themselves legally. And so I wrote letters to both senators and the congressmen, and they all sent me the correct forms to go through, and did that. I was told I was on 2-year or 2.5-year waiting list, first in and first out kind of deal. And then last year in the fall, they called me up, the Army called me up and said, we're going to start to investigate your case. They sent somebody from Fort Lewis who was a member of the CID, and he interviewed me in the Coeur d'Alene Police Department, and so they fingerprinted, and I had sent them all kinds of information. And the results that I gave you came to me late December, early January, or early January of this year.
I have a copy that you were very kind to give me from the Department of the Army about this whole long process of regaining your identity and letting everyone know that it was actually Paul Mahar that went to Vietnam. I want to read one paragraph which I think is really, really interesting about how this has come to that particular kind of conclusion. And they say in the report that was from, I believe, November 1993, there are those who would say that such a relationship born of deceit can never become legitimate, that there is a cloud over his service that can never be lifted. We disagree. It is also commonly said that to every rule there is an exception, and if such be the case, then this case is an exception to that rule. And so that certainly has been established. And would you tell our viewers that, again, you're dealing with records, are you going to have 2 files, one for you and one for Frank Klauss?
The Army said that they would create a new file for me. Now, that they're in the process of doing that. I'm not sure how long that'll take. I was impressed with the professionalism with which the Army handled this. You know, all of a sudden, you know, this is not something they probably wanted to admit. Their legal department said, holy smokes, what we got here, you know, this is we have to set precedents, but they looked and said, from what you read, this happened. We can't deny it. What are we going to do about it? And so I was impressed with that. Yeah. And in some ways, you have to remember that the Army is like family to me, in a sense. And
there's a lot of factors about who serves anyway, Steve, when we get into that, I'll return it to Steve.
Paul, we're talking about 10 years ago when you started this process. When you think back to that time, what was the motivation? Was it a desire to contact Army buddies who would have, if they'd been looking for you, would have been looking for somebody with a different name, or was it this a growing feeling in you that said, I served my country under very difficult circumstances at a particularly difficult time, and I think that I need to be able to talk about that? What was the one thing?
I don't think there's ever one thing. I think one of the things was I wanted to find the friends. There was all these feelings about it, you know, that were coming out of me, just going, probably because the books and the movies were coming out, and so there was association there. But it's like saying, these are the things that happened, and a lot of what was going on was silly or stupid, you know, I mean, in my mind. And yeah, I wanted to find Fred and other people. And I had something to say, and I wanted a forum or something to say it. And I think the forum, that idea came later. But it first started, I was looking for my friends, and I was telling Frank that I'm going to find them, and I will keep you updated as to my progress to doing this. And I had said that I would walk you through this, you know, if we need be. And then when it got closer to happening, years later, and that would have been 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 years, 4 years ago, I think, that I said I'm going to proceed with this or something, then he stopped. He wouldn't talk to me anymore, or he changed his phone number or made it unlisted again. And at that point, I haven't heard from him.
In the first show, I asked you whether or not, at 19, when you decided to impersonate Frank, if you thought at all about the possible legal consequences, and you said, no, I was young and felt invincible, as we all do at that age. But now, you're a considerably older man with much more experience. Did you have any concern in 1984 that there might be some legal implications?
Or 1992. You know, the thought crossed my mind. I thought about it, that, you know, that something could happen. I think because of the nature of what I did and because of the nature of the Vietnam War and the draft, it's not something that anybody would want to bring up. But you do what you have to do. Sometimes you have to do it anyway. You know, it's kind of ridiculous that somebody would bring legal charges against Frank or I for this. That's really entering a world of absurdity.
One other thing I want to clear up, you mentioned that when you first contacted the Department of the Army, they mentioned a 2.5-year backlog.
Mm-hmm.
Now, certainly there weren't 2.5 years worth of people like you who had impersonated a friend. These are anyone who's applied for a correction to a service record. Is that the backlog we're talking about?
That's the backlog, yeah.
To your knowledge, is this the first time and the only time during the Vietnam conflict that happened? Do you know of anyone else? Did the Department of the Army say yes to this? Oh, we've seen
no,
this.
No, they
case.
haven't said anything else. I think that there may have, I've heard circumstances or stories where this has happened before. I don't know if it's ever happened without the basic and the AIT training. You know, but I think it has happened in other ways.
I see what you're saying, where someone from the very beginning assumed a different name.
Now, I've heard of that before. And I'm sure that it's happened. I don't think my experience is unique.
And of course, we talked before the show briefly. There's a parallel in literature, and that's in Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. There's a character in there who instead of going into the service, though, goes to the guillotine for a friend.
Tis a far better thing. Yes, exactly. And I remember, and I was just kidding earlier or during the break, that yes, I read that in high school, and I think because of my upbringing, which would have been the way I was raised, and the parochial school, there was a nobility. And I grew up reading James Fenimore Cooper and Sir Walter Scott and all those books. And so there was a desire for nobility.
We've got to ask Paul to share with us the line he said about the drill instructors or top sergeants in the Army didn't scare you because of your parochial training. What was it?
Oh, no, I had said, I said, well, if Vietnam may have been tough, but I don't know if it was tougher than 9 years of parochial school. My mother will get me for that one. Yeah. She'll get me for that one. Yeah, but Vietnam was hard, but so was the rest of life.
Paul, when you're going through all this change and getting your identity back, I believe when you came to the United States after Vietnam, you had given the uniforms back to Frank Klauss and the medals and so forth. Tell us that story. They went there, and then with your story out now, you got that back, did you not?
I gave him the uniform back. The medals, I think they sent him the medals after I had, maybe 6 months or a year after I had came back, because I don't remember getting them overseas. And so I just left all that stuff there, and I left some pictures. You know, I had some photographs, and he said they don't exist anymore because I took a 3-day pass to Vung Tau, and I have a picture, or there was a picture with me holding a 23-year-old python. You know, it was at a carnival. They took your picture for $1, and they took him out of a cage for $1, and he was pretty big, I'll tell you. But I had 3 days worth of beer drinking to get my courage up to have this picture with the snake, which I was determined to do, and I did. But all that was left, and then in 1984 or 85 or somewhere, he sent me the uniform back and the medals. And he said the pictures were long gone, and the uniform sits in my closet. You know, it's not important. You know, maybe I'll give it to my daughter. Maybe I'll give it to a museum or something.
There's something symbolic here, though. When you gave him the uniforms, it had Frank Klauss' name on the uniform, and when you got them back, that name had been removed, had it not?
Yeah, he would have taken that off, and you're not the first person that used that as a symbolism. That never crossed my mind as somebody mentioned. I would have expected that he would have taken the name off. You know, I'm not sure why he did, but that was normal.
But really the name Frank Klauss doesn't go with the uniform because he didn't wear it into Vietnam.
Yeah.
Something else that I want to get across in the program, and again, I was just the other day and talking with you, really impressed about how strong you feel about this. There's been a number of people who have told your story, and they have indicated in doing so that you're a hero, and making out certain people's hero and certain as villains. Share with our viewers what your position is.
This is the media. Heroes and villains is what sells. You know, I've put 50,000 words on paper. I've written a book, and I'm going to have it published my way, whatever it takes, so that this whole thing of good guys and bad guys doesn't exist. We were 19 years old. We were 20 and 20, if it doesn't matter. There was a job to do. You went ahead and you did it. Your parents, you got kids, you got classes. You just go up and you do what you're supposed to do, you know, and you just look for a little credibility, you know, just a little. Well, I did a good job today, or when I got up this morning, I put on my boxing gloves and entered the ring, and I did a job today that I can go home and I can sleep well at night. That's it, you know. Anything else you create is so it gets sold in terms of drama. That's the nature of it's the nature of books and movies or wherever else.
I noticed in the interview that I watched with Mr. Brokaw, he'd ask you the question is, have you forgiven Frank Klauss? And with this attitude, I know you have a different attitude about that there is nothing to forgive. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were two kids and we played roles. I mean, I had the better role. I was the Lone Ranger, and he was maybe the guy with the black hat. You can look at it that way, but that's the way life works. When somebody goes out there and stands in the middle, and gets on the stage, whoever was up there goes and plays another role. That's human nature. That's what we do. You want to give one guy 3 stars and somebody else no stars? That's not impressive.
Steve Sheen.
Is this for you a little like getting a part of your life back? Was there a long time there when there was that period where you couldn't just talk to anybody about it? You couldn't be real public about it?
I couldn't be public. I could talk to people about it, and I think for me that what I get out of this is somewhere along the line I'm going to be able to talk to high school classes, talk in NIC to 19 and 20-year-olds, because I marked my transition into adulthood by what I did. I think my experiences belong to that generation, and just to have a dialogue with it.
What would your message be if you talked to a high school class today about what happened? I mean, if you were going to leave them with something that you learned from this extremely unusual event in your life, what would it be?
I'll give you 2 themes. One is that you can be more than what you are, somebody that protects their own interest, and that there are abstract values out there that are worth pursuing. And the other is to be aware of, think about social contracts, that you have obligations to ideas, to people and to friends, and to establish what the rules of those social contracts are. And if there was one more, I'll tell you what I tell my daughter when life is like a shopping mall. Be aware of what you buy. And that would be the themes to any kind of speeches or talks that I had.
One of the reasons you went public with the role change that you went through was to contact old friends from the service. Have you been able to? Been lots of exposure. Has anyone seen the show and gotten in touch with you?
Yeah, I talked to Al Cerner, or Luke, his name was, the other night, about a week ago. His sister saw the show and said, "Oh, that's my brother." So called him up, or called NBC up, and NBC sent me the names of some people who called me. So there are 3 or 4 that I've talked to, and we've had good conversations.
What was their reaction?
Vietnam was strange and outrageous. Yeah, it fits. It fits. Yeah, we were all just a little out there. It's not that strange to them, because Vietnam was stranger than my story.
Certainly, your coming clear and the Army verifying this could affect down the road in the future too. That it could have something to do with, as a Vietnam veteran, any benefits and so forth. And so, and that may not happen. But the point is that would seem wise for the Army to want to clear this all up too, because Frank is not in the situation of qualifying for the kind of things that I assume by just having basic training. I guess what I'm looking at from a legal perspective, here are 2 individuals. One of them did do basic training and some special training, so was technically in the Army for a while.
Right.
And here's another person who went to Vietnam. That may go back to the 2 files and so forth, but it is, and youth at 19 don't think about this, but it does create a legal quagmire, doesn't it, in relation to that?
To benefits?
I mean, or to just the whole business of the future and the status of the 2 people served in one position in some way.
I assume that they're going to just say that we both served.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that that he has his time as service there and I have mine. And when I wrote a letter to the Army, 3 years ago now, as I asked for 2 things. I asked them to say that it happened, because that way I could pursue other avenues. Because other than that, I'm a liability, because if I'm lying, that's a mess. And the other thing is I asked for the records of what happened to me when I was there, for my personal satisfaction. They said they couldn't give me that because it wasn't under my name, and so that's fine. And that's all I asked for. I didn't ask for benefits or any of those other things.
Right. And it's very important to make that point clear. Steve, we have
Yeah,
about 2 minutes.
one of the things, and I read the reports too, and I believe it was a review board of some kind that made the final determination in your favor.
Mm-hmm.
Have they given you any indication of the time process or what happens next?
That was in January, and they said that all further correspondence should go to St. Louis, and I've written them a couple letters and gotten no response because I'm not writing to a person, I'm writing to a title. And so just recently I went to Steve and Judy, who you probably know, who first helped me file this, and to the woman that works in his office, I can't think of her name now, which takes care of this, and she's going to go to the Army and find out when and where it will happen. So I should hear something within 30
Is the last chapter of your book waiting on that word, or are you finished with your...
I have a choice of, I have one last chapter. I got 3 or 4 in my head as to the way to end it. I'm not sure which way it'll end.
On that note, we end this program, and on behalf of Steve Shank and our staff, Paul Mahar, thank you. You've been very generous with your time, and I appreciate so much your sharing this story with our viewers throughout the Northwest and in Canada, and very good luck to you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Paul Mahar, who's told an incredible story about taking the place of another man by the name of Frank Klauss and fighting in Vietnam and returning and reestablishing his identity. I know you found this very, very fascinating, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will discuss yet another topic. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.